Hi, welcome to the DRH show, where I have wide-ranging conversations with interesting people. We talk about all things psychology, mental health, and wellness. Today, I'm joined by an entrepreneur and mental health advocate, Angelo Vincenzo De Boni. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Dennis. It's so nice to be here talking to you.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, Angelo. We've collaborated a few times. You've written a number of articles for PsychReg, and you've also written a brilliant article for PsychReg Journal of Psychology, and we'll talk more about that. But for now, let's start off with you telling us your backstory, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Well, I hope you're buckled in, because my story is, I think people often misunderstand when they meet me, because I'm an entrepreneur and I have a business, and I come across now as quite calm, but actually my childhood was very rough. There was a couple of sort of pivotal moments in my life that ended up sort of resurfacing now in my 40s. I grew up very poor in South Africa. I know I mentioned that, I think, in the paper that we published. Just to give it context, that there's a misconception that inevitably, if you grew up during apartheid, you were privileged. But there was a distinction between the Afrikaners, who were privileged by the system, and then the immigrant workers, who were like my parents, who were definitely not privileged. And in fact, they came here with nothing, and a lot of them never really achieved much at all. It's only my generation now that is achieving anything. And some of us are still struggling with that as well. But I think the important thing when we're in a conversation about psychology, I think, there's these pivotal moments that create who you are. And if I go back to my memories, it's when my mother was schizophrenic for many years, and eventually she had a full breakdown. My father was a very repressed, aggressive man. He used to beat all of us when we were living with him. And then at 13, I almost committed suicide. I put a double-barrel shotgun literally here under my chin and nearly killed myself. Very nearly. I mean, I had my finger on the trigger, and it was seconds away. But I realized I couldn't do that to my mom, so I stopped that. But it wasn't like I had a solution. I had to just carry on. I was very young. I had no power over my life, and there's a lot of things that I remember. And as I got more secure and more prosperous in my adulthood, those things started coming back up. So I think even though now, yes, I appear, stable and successful, we all have a background that's more interesting, and when it comes to why we are in psychology, I think those things actually do matter. But yes, I've owned a business for the last 21 years. I've achieved a relative amount of success. But one of my big highlights before I started studying psychology was I did my pilot's license as well, which was very exciting. And funny enough, the most exciting part was flying an airplane, obviously, but the most interesting part was the whole psych block that we had to do for flying. And I ended up sort of going deeper and deeper into that, and that really defined where I started going. And then a few years later, I signed up to study psychology.
Well, thank you, Angelo, for sharing such a very personal and intimate account of your experience. And I'm glad to hear that you're actually in a better shape now. Just a reminder, just like what we always say in PsychReg, some of the topics that we mentioned, like Angelo's experience of suicide and mental health issues, can be quite depressing for some people. So if you find it quite distressing, just look for a mental health professional. You already slightly touched upon this, your article about PsychReg Journal of Psychology. You mentioned about your experience growing up in South Africa, but if you could please expand on this, because there's also a bit of essentially it's all about male psychology. So what what made you interested in that aspect of psychology, male psychology, and also could you expand about what exactly is the kind of psychology that you've been exposed to in South Africa?
Yeah, so look, I've personally had counseling. I went to couple therapy with my with one of my girlfriends. I had trauma counseling for a traumatic event, and I saw the value immediately. It was just what I've actually told people very often is, you know, psychologists are a bit like mechanics. You don't know what's wrong with you, and you don't know the tool that will be required to fix that, and they often do. I know we don't always have the answers, but that's the thing that I experienced with counselors and one or two actual psychologists. I also went for my ADD when I was an adult already, and that was a very enlightening few weeks that I spent with this lady who listened and basically told me I'd found ways to manage my ADD as an adult by necessity. But then when I started studying, so I'll get to the paper that we did. When I started studying, I realized that there was so much focus on, you know, sort of, you know, well-being and coping and trauma, and no one in none of this material, they would mention murder, suicide, and rape and gender-based violence that is an epidemic in South Africa. I mean, it's if you're watching this and you don't know, look it up. It's really bad. And I was like, but why are we not talking about the men that are doing this? You know, what is going on with the men, and surely psychology should be addressing that. So the more I would sometimes ask questions about it, and it would, the educators would often just brush it off and they'd move on, you know. And then when I had the opportunity to do this paper, it seemed to me like a very good way of addressing something that I think is being kind of brushed over, which is broadly speaking male psychology, but in specific context to the catastrophe that's happening in South Africa. I must just tell you, like, for me, if you'll notice, I get a bit emotional about this because there was so much hope in the new South Africa in 1994, you know, that has been squandered to a certain extent, or just failed to materialize. And I really, if I can address that in any way, I really want to, you know. And coming from the psychology perspective, it just seemed to me like there wasn't enough attention being paid with what's going on with men. And then when you look at the developments in male psychology in the UK and America, they are addressing these things, and they're trying to find ways of rechanneling masculinity and male aggression to more pro-social activities. So I think it's important that we put psychology in the context of the country and of the, you know, the socioeconomic conditions. And I didn't see anyone doing that when it comes to South Africa. There's lots of papers that come out of South Africa, but they tend to focus on inequality and trauma and generational trauma, which are all valid. But then it's almost as if they skip over that one very important aspect, you know, 50% of the population, basically. And very often the people that are caught up in the worst elements of, you know, let's say bad socioeconomic and psychological conditions. So that was kind of my motivation for writing that. And I think the context of being a post-apartheid South Africa, I think a lot of people don't quite understand what that means, because we are a post-oppressive and tyranny society, which are, you know, we're alive. We lived that, and we saw the change. Whereas many countries have that in their history, but it's very past. You know, it's in the past. And South Africa is seeing that in the present, how that affected change, and how it's at the moment, unfortunately, being sort of capitalized by the opportunistic politicians So, I don't really want to talk about politics, but there's definitely an element of the brushing over of very real psychology issues in society for the sake of perpetuating the current kleptocracy that we have, which just goes on and on and on. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was definitely my motivation for jumping on that opportunity to write that paper.
Yeah, and I would like to personally thank you for choosing PsychRich Journal of Psychology to publish that article. Now, for anyone who wants to read your article, what I'll do is I'll put on the link so they can read it. PJP is open access, so you don't have to pay anything to read Angelo's article. Now, it's clearly evident the way you talk, even though your background is really in business, that you really have a well-developed understanding of social science and psychology in particular. But you've mentioned it in a number of your articles that you're actually a mature student, and we actually have a shared experience. I'm also a matured student when I came to university. But if you could just share to us, what's your experience like studying as a mature student, especially your background is from a different field?
Well, can I give you the lighter side of it first? Going into, I started at a private college where it was mostly a very small class. I think we started with 16, and mostly Generation Z students. I'd say middle class to wealthy students. Easily 75% when we started, because a few people have dropped out since, but 75% female. And in I walk, and I think they all thought I was one of the educators when I first walked in, and then I sat down next to them, and in the first few weeks, I'm very grateful that the college had these, what do you call them? These initiation icebreakers, and they got really weird because we had to sometimes be quite physical with each other. And I was completely into it and possibly had the edge because because I was perhaps more committed to the process. I realized, I come here to experience this, whereas maybe some of them were hoping for a more calm academic atmosphere, but it was like within those few weeks, we all had to, state our own reasons for being there. And we quickly saw that the thing that we have in common is that we've had experiences that whether we benefited from psychology or whether we needed psychology, and we united on that level, and the level that we're here to help ourselves, I suppose, but also to help other people. I think it's a very unique environment where a bunch of people will confess to each other that they're here literally to learn how to help other people. There's not many environments where that happens. Usually we're quite happy saying, I'm here to make myself rich or whatever, So I want to throw in one particular thing though, because it's something that, again, resurfaced from my childhood. I had a very difficult school experience in my childhood because, partly because I had ADD, which was, in those days, totally unheard of, especially in South Africa. But also because I actually read a lot at home, and often I would come to class with counter arguments for the teachers. And the teachers, this was we lived in an authoritarian environment, and the schools were state schools. So asking questions at class wasn't really acceptable, But I found it was quite bizarre, because I found when I started at this college, there were a few things that happened where one particular educator was bullying during the class, had a very bullying, domineering tone over specifically the weaker students. And I ended up having to, I couldn't deal with it, because I was like, that's what was done to me, and I tried to just let it go. I thought maybe it was like a role play scenario or something, but it wasn't. It went on week after week. So eventually I'd asked for him. There was actually an incident that eventually happened, which meant that a lot of the class were talking about not going back to class, literally of boycotting that class. So I asked for a meeting with the director, and I kind of put myself front and center as an adult. I'm an adult, and I experienced this at school. I didn't expect to see this here at this college, and I think you need to know about it, and I think you need to do something about it. And actually, it was received really well. I think the tone at my college is very helpful and progressive in the sense of wanting to progress. And they listened to me and they paid attention to that. So that was an interesting, how can I say, unexpected development of being in that environment, in an educational environment. And there's been a couple of times I've had to kind of keep my mouth shut, because I'm used to being the boss, and I'm used to giving my opinion whenever it's necessary. So that was a character development thing that I had to kind of process. I think I've worked that out now, and I've managed to make quite good friendships within the class with a few of the older students. And I will just add as well that I really believe that more educational environments should encourage older students to come, because we actually bring such a valuable perspective and obviously life experience, but also an element of history that we're more aware of. There were some things in one class, for example, I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically there were things in one class that were brought up that I found a little bit offensive, because it pretended like apartheid was not ended. It made out as if this massive event in our history, in my history, never happened. So I sort of butted in and made a point of saying, I was there. I watched Mandela being released, and I watched the country almost go up in flames. And I was there when we voted for a new dispensation, So it was interesting, because if I hadn't said anything, that element, that realistic knowledge would never have come into the class. So I can imagine that happening in lots of classes all the time, where that just never happens, because there isn't someone old enough, or someone who hasn't read the history, maybe, So yeah, it's been very interesting. And on the other hand, now that I've done this transition from owning and running a business to being a full-time student, it's been wonderful. It's been a massive, how can I say, like a lifeline to, my sense of identity.
Absolutely.
So that's been really amazing.
Hello?
Sorry?
Oh, sorry, I thought we well, I'm glad to hear that,
Yeah,
Angelo, you've actually quite had like a sort of a rewarding experience with your university experience, even though you came there quite later in your life. Now, as you've mentioned earlier, you're actually quite strong opinionated, and there are a range of things which you have an opinion about, and I understand one of those is about masculinity. So I just want to hear your thoughts about this phrase called toxic masculinity, and for you, what would be a healthy and acceptable form of masculinity?
You're right. I am quite passionate about this topic, and it's weird, because I've actually been passionate about this my whole life, but I didn't realize it. Again, you see me now, I'm 46 years old, I've owned my own business, and people make all these assumptions, okay? But actually, I struggled as an adolescent, right up until I was about 25. I struggled with my male identity. I struggled basically with what I saw in the mirror, because the men that I knew growing up were horrible, toxic people, So I think I struggled with that in different ways. but it's something that I have actually faced, you know. I do remember even the moment when I started growing stubble. I had a panic because my dad had stubble, and my dad was a bad man, you know. And it horrified me, you know. I think it's one of the reasons that I became suicidal, because I was confronting this identity of a male coming out, and I didn't feel like I had control of that, you know. But I want to say the finding a path for me was quite difficult because I had no role models. But on the other hand, you know, the 80s and the 90s, I'd say as well, there was a lot of what we used to call metrosexual behavior. All the bands we liked were very metrosexual, often homosexual band members and lead singers and that kind of thing. So that whole world was completely different, and I had no problem with it, you know. So there was an element of being exposed to divergent ways of being male, which wasn't like stated. It was just there for us to see, you know. And I must say, I'm very grateful for that, because I found a way of still being me, but adapting to the fact that I am actually male, and I have all the usual testosterone driven behavior. I can be aggressive. I have a temper. You know, my ego is fragile. All those things, you know. So I think there's elements of this that you can't avoid, but you also have to find a way that you are happy to live with. And on the other hand, I've been an artist my whole life. I went through periods of just painting, which was very bizarre to my other male friends. But then again, I didn't have many male friends. I always had lots of girlfriends, female friends. So I wasn't your typical guy anyway, and I certainly couldn't pretend to be, because I just wasn't interested. So I think, if you get what I'm saying, like, I think we have to realize that I think very often toxic behavior can be toxic masculinity. It can be toxic parenting. I mean, I had to live with my grandmother for a few years, and she was an extremely toxic person. I'm afraid to say, I'd have to say she was worse than my father. So to say that there's toxic masculinity isn't really helpful. But having said that, you know, if someone presents me with someone who's like my father and says this is toxic, I would agree. But we should accept that anyone can be toxic, and we should be focusing on giving young men, especially, but people in general, we should be giving them exposure to different ways of being yourself, because that's actually okay. Just because you look in the mirror and you see something with stubble and you know, and muscles, it doesn't mean you have to be a dominant bully, and it doesn't automatically mean that you know, behave a certain way socially, and you behave a certain way with your partners and all that kind of thing. So I hope I'm getting my message across. I think what we should admit is that being toxic is not something that people really choose. It's usually a result of bad things, and limited opportunities. So I kind of feel like we should sympathize with those people and other gives out of, especially for young men. I know a lot of it. A lot of friends over the years were very masculine men, and we were friends because they needed my version of masculinity. You know, I understand that now. I didn't realize I was doing that at the time, but these guys would listen to me, you know, and I would often have very intimate conversations with guys one-on-one, because I realize now, because they were looking for a different way to express themselves. So so I think it is a big issue, and I think you know, recently we've had people writing about a lot about the research into masculinity and the different forms that we can take in the modern world. And now I think that's 100% correct. We need to make it possible and give them permission, basically. I just want to add one little thing, though, that we must acknowledge that it's very, very difficult for someone who comes from a toxic environment to suddenly adopt a more sensitive and gentle form of masculinity. Because I lived through this. I know that the way I got through, my survival mechanisms were to revert to my masculine identity and to use that as a shield and a dominant force in any way I could, because that was the only power I had. So I think we've got to be very careful about how you approach these guys and these young men, especially. But definitely, I'm feeling like one of the ways we can do it is by showing them by example, by giving them better role models. I think you'll affect a lot of young men and women just by simply being a role model, and that's not easy to do, but it's the first thing we should do.
Absolutely. You made a crucial point here, Angelo, when you said that you can't really just, attach the word toxic to someone because of their gender. And I think like one of, what's most of the researchers in male psychology would say that, a lot of men are actually die of suicide. A lot of men die of suicide. And it really alienates them if we make their identity a toxic one by calling it toxic masculinity. You really made a good point about that. Now, another thing that I want to ask your opinion about, Angelo, is what's your take on decolonizing psychology? Because I think it's also quite prevalent, the idea of decolonization in South Africa as well as here in Britain. So I just want to hear your insight about that.
Okay, so it's a hot topic and it's a minefield. I just want to say I've read some of the arguments by prominent decolonizer advocates, psychologists, people who are quite high up in South Africa in psychology and universities. And I must say my general feeling is, first of all, it's quite fascinating because as a South African, as I'm reading their arguments, I actually agree with most of what they're saying, because one of the problems, one of the things that went wrong in South Africa obviously was colonialism. So for them to notice now, and I'm going to paraphrase, but the one of the biggest advocates for this has pointed out that there's a constant stream of liberal ideas, and when I think when he means liberal, I don't think he means in the the traditional European sense of liberal. I think what he means is the current American radical form of liberalism, because he criticizes it and he says, basically, how are we supposed to keep accepting this constant stream of new liberal ideas that keep coming out of the West, when you could argue, and they do argue, that it's exactly those ideas that have caused a lot of problems in South Africa as it is. So their fear is that it becomes a neocolonialism, okay? And I must say I had a moment in researching a lot of this where I found myself nodding and going, yes, they're right. Enough is enough. My loyalty to my country and my people, my countrymen, is that we should be able to do it ourselves. We don't need constant aid and constant input and constant advisors. I literally the other day met a lady who's living in South Africa, living in effectively a mansion, because she works for the World Bank and is advising the South African government. I mean, I find that really bizarre. We've got our own experts in South Africa. Why is that even necessary? So you see how the economic colonialism and the ideas colonialism, you can't separate the two, because the one leads into the other, and that's what they pick up on, and that's what they don't want. And I mentioned in something else that that's Dambisa Moyo, who's an economist, and she's written a few books. She'll spell this out for you from the economic perspective, but you may as well replace the word economic with psychology, because that's the same argument. That's what they're saying. And in many ways, I agree with that. On the other hand, it gets a bit messy, because when you start going into the next level, so if you want to decolonize, what are you going to replace it with? And that gets awkward, because on the one hand, you get prominent psychologists from other countries who advocate for us developing our own understanding of the ideas that came out of ancient Egypt, for example. Okay. But then it seems to me like it's the Southern African intellectuals and psychologists who kind of reject that, because they're sensitive to the differences between Northern and Southern Africa. And then there's a lot of conflict within this resistance, let's say, that, for example, they believe that someone like Muammar Gaddafi was a hero for Africa, which, anyone who knows anything about Muammar Gaddafi would laugh at that and say that is absolutely ridiculous. But even today, as we speak, you'll find people on Twitter openly saying how it was because Muammar Gaddafi was about to become the emperor of Africa that the West got rid of him. I mean, this is ridiculous stuff. So to me, it's confusing. You want to decolonize, but are you decolonizing the system of science itself? Because that's not a colonial import. It's a human import. And I'm very relieved that one of the most prominent decolonizer writers, Makubela, I've forgotten his first name. Anyway, he's in some of the stuff that I've written. He spells it out quite well. And even though he advocates for decolonization, he admits that we also need to find our own system and develop the folk psychology in South Africa, because at the moment it's kind of been insulated and protected, and it actually is not helpful in the modern age. The types of folk psychology that that maybe should be recorded, but it needs to be developed. So I want to say one thing though that I've thought about after I read another paper that he wrote more recently. In my experience, we talk about decolonizing psychology, but I would say you can't decolonize psychology and then leave people like Marx, Foucault, and Derrida, and all these other characters who follow that stream of socialism and the power of the worker and the balance of power in general and all that kind of thing. There's a lot of that in our textbooks here in South Africa. So are we going to decolonize them as well? Because I'm not getting the sense. It seems like they want to decolonize the things they don't like. And that already, to me, is where the slippery slope comes in. I would say we need to stick to what is science and what has a humanist approach. If we stick to those principles, I mean, I think they're actually quite simple. There's no reason why psychology can't be very useful and very powerful in Africa. In fact, I would say it's very necessary that we address those things. So, yeah, it's an ongoing argument. I'm not sure the Enlightenment period that Africa in general, I think, is facing. I'm not sure it's going to be over anytime soon, but it's a very interesting argument. So what I would also add is don't discount if someone says they want to decolonize, actually listen to their argument, because there's some truth to it. It's not as simple as saying, oh, well, you're being ridiculous, you know. But like I say, then if it gets to the nitty gritty, how do you decolonize without removing all the massive, all the body of work which comes from the socialist perspective and the postmodern perspective? I mean, that all comes from Europe. So how do you deal with that? So maybe, you know, we should be focusing on material that originates in Africa. So let's do our own research. Let's do our own theories and test them. And yes, it might come out that there are some things that are unique to the emic solutions that come out of South Africa or Africa in general.
Absolutely. And what I just want to add to this conversation about decolonizing psychologists, you've already said this, but I just want to highlight this, that it's really easy to, you know, to destroy something, to decolonize something, but to offer something that would replace it, that's the most challenging part. And the problem with this, you know, if we are to decolonize something, it becomes like less of an evidence-based field, but more of an activism. And that's my problem with that. And it's not just, you know, in countries, it's widespread. In certain countries rather, but it's widespread, because even I did my undergraduate degree in the Philippines, and we have Filipino psychology. And even I, as a student, it really sounds problematic to me, the idea of Filipino psychology, because we are actually replacing a lot of you know, like the popular psychological theorists that we know, you know, from Skinner and from other scientists. We're replacing it with more of, you know, theoretical framework. And the problem with that is that you can't really like apply that in other societies, you know, like you can't apply Filipino psychology in South Africa. But the psychology that we know from Freud, well, relatively you could apply it to, you know, that there's a global application. And so that's my idea. That's my problem with, you know, the trouble with decolonizing psychology. But you made a good argument with it. It's really a gray area. But we'll move on to something which is more which is less problematic, less political. I understand you also have an experience about orthorexia, and you wrote an article about this on PsychReg. So a lot of people would not be familiar what orthorexia is. So if you could just give us a snapshot of this, of this, shall we say, mental health issue.
Well, in the DSM-5 at the moment, but I think you might find it might be in the next edition. It's just at the moment described as obsession with whether it's the quality and the type of food that you obsess over. So that's the broad description. I think it probably falls more into obsessive behavior, but in my own experience, it has a lot to do with your development and your identity versus the conflict of social situations and all that kind of thing. So my experience was that at the age of 16, I met a girl who was anorexic and bulimic, and it became the way our relationship functioned. It functioned around food. We actually, on the surface, it looked like we got better because we, as a couple, were very functional, and she stopped her habits, her bulimic habits, and it seemed like she stopped her anorexic behavior, but actually what had happened is we transferred that obsession onto what and how much we were eating. So now the thing is, at 16, I was becoming a man. And I realized many years later, well, in the last few years, when I started researching, adolescent development and orthorexia, that there was a very bad combination going on there. I'd met someone who'd found a way of, let me say, morphing her identity by changing her diet and by obsessing on her weight and all these other things. And for me, it slid perfectly into avoiding becoming my father, or any other toxic man that I'd had encounters with. So I understand that now, and it does explain a lot of things that I did at the time, and how long I did it for. So I ended up doing it for 7 years. I became extremely unhealthy. I've still got photos of me from those days, and I mean, I weigh 85 kilos now, and in those days I weighed 62. I'm 1.8 meters tall. I'm a tall guy, and I should not weigh 62 kilos. So I was extremely unhealthy, and even though I was so unhealthy, I persisted with this obsessive diet. And it was only when her and I broke up that I, just under different circumstances, I started eating differently, and suddenly I had energy. I started developing muscle tone, and everything changed. I struggled with my digestion for years after that. I think that probably had a lot to do with the damage that I'd done, and with basically never really figuring out what I could eat, because I was so obsessive about eating purely vegetarian. I don't know if your viewers will remember the Fit for Life diet, that a lot of us became very obsessive about. I was fanatical about that, and I wouldn't even come to your house if you were cooking meat. Now I do eat meat. I don't eat a lot of meat, and I've realized that I know it's a bit besides the topic, but I've realized that for me it's more important about how much I eat, because people with ADD and ADHD, if you fuel that fire, it'll burn, and it'll burn till 3 a.m. So you really don't want to do that. I think physiologically I've probably changed as I aged as well. But the important point about this is the orthorexia would have looked like an obsessive eating video, but actually there was a developmental gender-based identity that was in its grip, and I found a way to freeze that whole process. It actually didn't work, but that's what I thought I was doing, because when I looked in the mirror, I saw a boy. I saw a young boy, because I was so thin. Look, I think also people treat thin people differently as well. It was quite bizarre, and that I said in my little blog about orthorexia that women really encouraged it. The women that I met obviously liked it. That's why they were drawn to me in the first place, and they encouraged it. So I was getting that ego feed, and at the same time suppressing this evil male that was coming out of my bones. I want to just mention that the person that really encouraged me, he didn't realize he was, but there's a guy called Jason Wood. You can find him on Twitter, who has written quite a lot about this. He has a blog, and I think he's releasing a book soon. I read some of his stuff, and I was just totally inspired. And I reminded myself that it's no good that we intellectualize different forms of masculinity, but we don't actually practice it. So I think it's important that the men who are aware of this practice this new form of masculinity, and it's important that we reach out to each other but also not necessarily just each other, but just show the world that there's a way of understanding being male, which can also be a progressive process, So yeah, that was the reason I felt like that blog was very important, and I'm really glad you published it on your page, because it'll get more exposure.
Absolutely, because even I've never heard of orthorexia until you've written that, and thank you for sharing your experience about your mental health and also about your wellness. Now, Angelo, we've been talking about a number of things. We talk about toxic masculinity, we talk about male psychology, and we talk about decolonizing psychology. But on a more positive note, are there any emerging trends in psychology or mental health that you're excited about?
So, to give it some context, I went through a period in the first year where I started worrying that there was no place for me in psychology as a straight white married 46-year-old male, because there's a lot of positions in psychology which, how can I say, sort of disarm anything I might have to offer, if that makes sense. But then I think the very good thing was I joined Twitter, and I started connecting with male psychologists all over the world, and seeing that they're very active and they're very passionate about their perspective or their field, So there's a guy called Phil Mitchell on Twitter who introduced me to the Palgrave Handbook of Male Psychology. And I don't want to be too dramatic here, but it changed my life because, God, reading that was just a massive boost of oxygen to my, well, I'd say first to my pride in being male, that there's so much we can do still. There's a completely untapped area of psychology that some of these men, the men and women who published the Palgrave Handbook of Male Psychology. So that was a huge thing for me. So I really think it's so important that we utilize the tools in psychology so that we can address the differences between male and female development that gives men a better chance in life, that will reduce the suicide rate, that will give us more options to achieve self-fulfillment and meaning. I know it's not really a new field, but the whole idea of the Enlightenment was kind of revived by Steven Pinker. The book Enlightenment Now, for me, was, I think I've read it 3 or 4 times now, because it was just mind-boggling that we needed to be reminded of what the purposes of the Enlightenment were. So I ended up at Steven Pinker partly because I used to be one of those quite fervent atheists. I've calmed down a lot from that now, because I'm starting to understand that there's a lot of value in understanding religions and how they operate in terms of psychology. So I think what's nice about what Steven Pinker is trying to do is he's reminding us of why these things are important and how they need to be maintained in the modern world. We can't just pretend like we can move on now and ignore those things and revert back to some sort of, I don't know, technocratic tribalism or something. I know he talks about these kinds of things quite a lot. And within that, I think Steven Pinker also talks about this, but evolutionary psychology to me seems to be finally, I know I've read things that have been published under evolutionary psychology, which I think 20 years ago were a little bit incoherent, but it seems to me that we're at the point now that behaviorism and just doing psychometrics over and over and over is not enough. We need to understand the evolutionary process and effect on psychology and on culture as well, because to me that really completes the circle of being able to understand human behavior. So yeah, I think male psychology is a wonderful development. If we understand that within an evolutionary psychology perspective, it makes much more sense, and it shouldn't create conflict between the two sexes. And even I don't want to go into this because I know it's a sensitive topic, but I really think if we took that approach, it would also help us understand a lot of what's going on with the children that are wanting to transition. I think if we understood the differences between male and female and the evolutionary effects and how that's being unraveled or unraveling in the modern world, which is so different to our evolutionary history, that would really help us understand. And I think the people that are experiencing those challenges would benefit from understanding those things because they can see it in context. And I just think that's invaluable. It's no good to say, the people that cling to behaviorism are under the impression that we can be reprogrammed when it suits us, when it suits society and when it suits the current culture. We can't do that. We can't keep doing that. So I think it's also just important to recognize that there's bad trends also, and so we've got to have a way of unraveling how they affect the rest of us. We can't just allow them to run amok and change the things that were good about psychology, the things that are good about psychology.
Yeah, well, definitely, as you've explained it, male psychology is really an emerging field, and it has a lot to offer, especially, a lot of men are struggling with their mental health. Now, Angelo, you've been quite busy. You're an entrepreneur, you're also a writer and a men's mental health advocate, but how do you relax? What's your distressing outlet?
Well, I have to say the biggest thing for me is being able to paint. I do my own art, and that's been a massive lifesaver in my life. When I was thrown out of school, I never got matric, so I was thrown out of school when I was 18. The thing that saved me was being able to do art and produce these amazing works. And that actually led to me being employed in advertising, and that's what led on to me changing my circumstances completely. So I'm very loyal to that, and I've found it to be a very rewarding process. Whether one buys the art or takes the art is irrelevant, because it's what I do, and it's keeping in contact with myself. I also do Pilates every day, which is mostly because I need to keep energy levels calm. But also, I hurt my back a few years ago, which is quite common with middle-aged men. And I just learned the lesson that you really need to keep yourself stretched and supple as you get older. Otherwise, you suffer more and more and more chronic pain. So I think that's a very important thing that middle-aged men need to preempt and be conscious of. And then I have to say, I know this sounds a bit cheesy, but since I sold my business earlier this year because lockdown just made it impossible to go on. So I sold off. But studying to me is extremely rewarding. The cycle of reading and then writing is very satisfying. So mostly I find studying maybe relaxing is not the word, but it's cathartic. So maybe that's my age, I don't know, but I did spend 21 years being an employer, which is very stressful. So for me, studying is actually quite satisfying. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'd say I think the reason I started studying was because I just recognized there was a lot that I could for some people, and I wasn't, when I tried to write a book before I started studying, and I realized I kept getting the constructs wrong. I kept using the wrong language, struggled with the language. So I realized I needed some kind of formal basis to build that on, So that's why I started studying. And for me, it's become important to try and reach people who seem to be in a cycle of making the wrong choices, making bad decisions and then getting stuck, as they say, getting stuck in the weeds, and not knowing how to get out of that process. So that's, to me, really sad. The modern world is supposed to have opened up opportunities to us, and for a lot of people, it's been the opposite. It's channeled them into these very narrow. I'm having this image of like cattle being pushed into those narrow steel things where they treat them, because that's the impression I get from a lot of people, and partly due to my circumstances, but partly due to my choices, that I haven't had those specific problems. So, for example, I don't have children, which is partly just by circumstance. But as I got older, it did become a deliberate choice. And I see a lot of people they've made that choice, but they haven't quite dealt with what that means. And then you get people who get married and haven't quite dealt with what that really means. So if I can help people adapt to those changes, I think that would be amazing. Certainly, if you can reach, I know probably most psychologists say this, but if you can stop one person committing suicide, then I think you've achieved something in your life.
Absolutely. And I apologize that we really have quite a bad connection, but thank you for just reading out that question. Basically, I was asking you, for the benefit of the audience, basically I was asking you, what's the most important thing you want the public to know about you and the work that you do? And you've just said it, that you just want to be an advocate for positive mental health, and that is very a noble thing to advocate for, Angela. And thank you for sharing to us about that. Now, we're already nearing towards the last bit of the interview, but I just want to hear from you what else is in the pipeline, and if people wanted to reach out to you, what platforms can they get in touch with you at?
Well, I've got, as you know, I'm on Twitter at Vincent Psych ZA. So that's Vincent Psych, like psychology, and ZA, which is meant to be for South Africa. I think I'm going to be writing more and more because I now have the time, which is lovely. I love the fact that I've been able to leave the business owner part of my life behind now and really focus on getting deeper and deeper into this field. And on my Twitter page, I've got a connection to a WordPress page, so I'll be adding stuff on there. And I'll be submitting stuff to certain publications and hope they are interested. I definitely want to be more involved in the network of psychology, because I'm very humbled by the people who are really proactive on Twitter and on certain networks that I know we know about, and I'm really excited to be part of that, because I think we can't be complacent about the threats that come out of psychology, or come from a theoretical position, because I don't want to go through it all, but basically in South Africa a lot of harm was done through naive and race-based psychology theories. So I've seen what that does when that kind of thing gets adopted officially by the government. We end up in weeds, and I just wish more people had, when South Africa had an opportunity to be a fair and free country back in the 40s, it was lost because people weren't exposed, people didn't read enough, and not enough people spoke out. So we spent the next 50 years battling an oppressive system, which was actually rooted in some very twisted ideas of psychology. So you see, for me, it is important that we stand up and we speak up, or at very least that we open the discussion, and then participate, not that we walk away and just dismiss people who have ideas that we don't like.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing to us your upcoming project and what you're working on at the moment. Angelo Vincenzo De Boni, it's a pleasure having you here on the DRH show, but unfortunately our time is up. I look forward to hearing more about your work. Thank you.
Thank you.